But we definitely did get a wide scope of perspective on people who wanted referendums and people who wanted mixed member proportional systems or STV systems, or people who thought it was absurd to change the voting system that we had. There was a whole broad perspective on that. And so I'll read you just a couple of paragraphs just from the report, because I think it gives you a very good sense. Over the past 6 months, the Special Committee on Electoral Reform has consulted broadly with Canadians from coast to coast to coast on electoral reform. This report is the outcome of the committee's consultation and deliberations. 3 overreaching themes emerged which have guided the committee through its deliberations. The first is to consider our democracy as being an ecosystem made up of various governance institutions such as Parliament and the public service, the public and civil society organizations that all interact and influence each other. As such, it is important for us to consider how changing how we vote will impact other elements of the democratic ecosystem. For example, how should we ensure that there is sufficient civic education to strengthen public engagement through a period of change? What will be the impact of an electoral change on Parliament and the assumed rules and conventions, Cabinet and confidence, the public service, the functioning of political parties, the country's political culture? These were all very important factors in coming to some conclusion or recommendations for the government that the committee had to look at. And you're going to see this if you have taken a look at the report. Later on, we can get into some of the recommendations that the committee made and a few of the other supplemental reports that we had at the end. But I do think that it would be an understatement to say that the impact that any electoral system has on various parts of our governance ecosystem is not minor, and it should definitely be looked at. And that's one thing we weren't able to do in as much detail as we would have liked over the 57 meetings that we had. We definitely delved into what the different systems out there are. We looked at unique systems that Canadians had created through a lot of hard work that they put in at home. And there were some really great innovative ideas. And so we didn't just look at the conventional systems. We looked at some, somewhat new, different types of systems that were created by people in our own country. But there's a lot of challenges we have in this country. And I know Yasmin spoke to us about some of those challenges as well. Having traveled to the north, a lot of what we heard was a lot different than what we hear in Toronto or Ottawa or in Vancouver or Quebec or a lot of places we go to. It was quite different. Iqaluit, I would say, was probably some of the most unique testimony that we had. But still, the Northwest Territories and the Yukon had a very interesting perspective too. And they consider themselves to be very distinct regions of Canada. And they would not appreciate being lumped in into a larger region and to have their representation come from the Yukon if they lived in the Northwest Territories or in Iqaluit. It's quite of a challenging place to be. Having gone to Iqaluit, I had never realized that they have 25 communities that are not accessible by road, that you have to fly to each community to have any contact with them. It's quite the challenge for an MP out there. And so these are some of the unique geographical differences from other countries that we definitely have to consider going forward, and how we create a system that would satisfy all Canadians, truly all Canadians in all different geographic locations. And some of the ideas were, perhaps creating a different rural-urban system that worked differently for those two different areas because of the geography. And that's something that we looked at quite closely as well.
I will try to get through some prepared remarks, or scrawled remarks, and then I'm happy, obviously, to elaborate on them. But as befits a talk at the Center for Ethics, I thought I would actually talk about what I see to be 4 ethical dimensions of where we're at now, where we've been for some time on this issue, sort of political ethics. And I want to start with the Liberal Party's electoral reform promise, so everybody knows. It reads as follows: "We will make every vote count. We are committed to ensuring that 2015 will be the last federal election conducted under the first-past-the-post voting system. We will convene an all-party parliamentary committee to review a wide variety of reforms such as ranked ballots, proportional representation, mandatory voting, and online voting, which is exactly the committee that Mr. Sahota served on. And then this committee will deliver its recommendations, which happened, to Parliament, and then within 18 months of forming government, we will introduce legislation to enact electoral reform, which puts them in mid-May, because it's 18 months from October 19th, 2015. So that situates us. And I wanted to talk about, having been in the middle of this kind of process and knowing what kinds of tensions arise when one is trying to both do good and be real. The four ethical dimensions are ethics of promise making, ethics of language appropriation / spin, ethics of political positioning, and ethics of decision. So in the ethics of promise, I think it's important to just, I don't think we ask this question enough, and we don't have clear enough answers as a political culture. What is the moral status of electoral platform promises in the real world of politics? So I wrote a couple pieces in Rabble on this about 6 months ago, and it's not something I have clear answers on, but we can distinguish between broken promises, which is the promise was made sincerely and it's been broken. What reasons and circumstances can be given for that? Secondly, false promises, promises not intended to be kept at all. And then thirdly, deceptive promises, which may be partly what we're dealing with here, maybe not. Promises that could be written, for example, so people read or hear X, even when, in a lawyer-like way, if you read it, it actually says Y. Or promises that are double-voiced, where Group 1 hears one promise and Group 2 hears another, okay? So I just want to set that up as a kind of we have to think about what kind of promises we're dealing with. Secondly, ethics of appropriation or spin. So let me trace a quick history for you of the phrase, make every vote count, to show its general use throughout recent Canadian political and even academic history to refer to proportional representation, whatever family or form of proportional representation. You can go back to 1999, a book by Henry Milner called Making Every Vote Count as a kind of a starting point. Around 2000, the group Fair Vote Canada was formed, and it became their motto or slogan, literally, make every vote count, and their only raison d'etre is proportional representation. When I was Democratic Reform critic, a tour across the country for a good 18 months, and a campaign that really went along with it, to try to get Canadians interested in the lead up to the election so that when we promised what we were going to promise, that people would know what we were talking about and we'd have a sense whether people were there and ready for PR. And we titled the whole campaign, Make Every Vote Count. And then we have the Liberal campaign promise. The top line, as I just read to you, we will make every vote count.
And I'm going to talk about the process of electoral reform. So I'm not going to talk about different systems. I'm just going to talk about how should we get there and what do we need to think about when it comes to the process. And as Ruby Sahota mentioned, I did appear before the committee, and I have actually read all 360 pages. And in interest of full disclosure, I should probably say that a lot of the things I said before the committee were actually quoted in the report. So I agree with those parts. Puts me in a rather awkward position to sort of criticize when it's my own research that's being cited. But anyway, so I'm going to just make a few brief points about the process, and then I want to turn to where we're at right now. So first of all, electoral reform differs from ordinary legislation because what's at stake are the very ground rules of how political power is distributed, right? So I argue that therefore we should have a higher standard of democratic legitimacy. It's not just ordinary legislation. So that's the first point. The second point is I looked at how electoral reform takes place around the world and in Canada, and I discovered through this research that there are a wide array of processes. There's not one that's used everywhere. We see all different kinds of process options. So because of that, I suggested that we really shouldn't see any one option as being mandatory. That being said, and this is my third point, I think that whatever process option or whatever combination is put together, it's really important that the process is both seems and actually is democratically legitimate. So then the question is, what is democratic legitimacy? How do we know that we've got a democratically legitimate process? And what I suggested to the committee was that we should be looking at three norms or three values. The first one is that the process should be neutral. In other words, it should be nonpartisan. The second norm is that there's a lot of consultation. In other words, outreach to experts, to groups, to other political parties, to Canadians. And the final norm or ideal would be that there is deliberation, which means that you have enough time to really think through all the different options and really come to some sort of conclusion as to what is the best option. The norm of nonpartisanship or neutrality, that's the one I just want to say a couple of things about because it's actually a really hard one. It's the hardest one because there's a lot of incentive for the governing party to use process to end up with an outcome that it favors, right? So it doesn't matter which governing party you have. So I'm not really speaking about any one political party. I'm just saying in general, that is a worry that governing parties like to choose rules that will entrench themselves in power. And that's something that people in my field are always going to be concerned about. So the other problem too with this is that the choice of process, like what process you choose, has a huge impact on what substantive outcome you end up with. So the choice of process is often as partisan as the actual choice of electoral system. And that's a really important point. Process is not neutral. So what process different political parties choose often has some connection, not always, but often has some connection to the outcome, the substantive outcome that they're actually looking for. One way to get around this problem is to ask that political parties cooperate. Right? So if all the political parties either agree, or if you can't get full agreement, that at least the political parties that represent either a majority or a supermajority of voters would be a preferable outcome, right? Because then you try and cut out that sort of self-interested motivation, right? Because everyone has to come into agreement. And by the way, I should just stress here that I don't think consensus is essential, but it is, of course, helpful if you can get it. Okay, so let me just now switch to the report and what I think about the process, and then I'll talk about where we're at now. So I think that I think the report, as Ruby Sahota outlined, in 6 months is quite extraordinary how much outreach was done. So it really is very, very impressive. The number of meetings, the number of expert witnesses, the cross-country tour, the fact that MPs held their own town halls and issued reports. There were e-consultations as well. I don't think that was mentioned, but e-consultations with hundreds of witnesses. So there was a huge amount of outreach. So that was, I thought, really positive. The one thing I thought wasn't so great was this self-imposed December 1st deadline. I just thought that really constrained it. It also, the whole process started in the summer, which is usually a dead time. And so it really didn't take off until the fall. And then there was a very short window for consultation and deliberation. So in my view, this self-imposed deadline was overly hasty, which actually the supplemental Liberal report seems to have also come to that conclusion. Now, on the referendum question, whether it makes sense to have a referendum, I know there's a lot of debate about that. My own view about it is referendums tend to favor the status quo. So parties that don't want change insist on a referendum. It's not always the case, but that is often, there is a connection there. The other advantage to having a bit more time is that you can build in another process option. So one possibility would be a referendum, but as I said, I've got some, concerns around that. But there are other things too, like a commission or a citizens' assembly that can actually enhance both the appearance and actuality of democratic legitimacy. The thing about referendums, just to go back to that for a second, is that they require a lot of public education, which doesn't always happen. And they also require high levels of participation in order to be representative, and that always doesn't happen. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing, too, is that there are lots of things that have happened in Canada that have big events that have not occurred because of referendums. For example, the adoption of the Charter, no referendum there. The rejection of the Meech Lake Accord, no referendum. And Confederation itself, no referendum, right? So we have big constitutional moments without a referendum taking place.
My take on this issue, I have a more specific concerns, and I'm bringing the historical perspective. And in fact, our clinic is now in the process of intervening in a case before the Supreme Court dealing with the right to vote for non-resident Canadian citizens. And so some of the arguments I'm making there is similar to the argument I'm making here today, which is that we need to look at the history of Canada when it comes to the right to vote. And of course, historically, through very overtly racist laws and policies, the Canadian government and a number of the provinces had explicitly denied the right to vote for members of many different racialized groups, including, but not limited to, Indigenous people, Chinese Canadians, Japanese Canadians, and so on. In fact, the disenfranchisement of Chinese Canadians started with our first Prime Minister, Sir John Macdonald, who introduced an election law in 1885, which expressly deprived persons from the quote-unquote Mongolian and Chinese race of the right to vote because, according to him, they had no British instincts or no British feelings or aspirations. And Chinese Canadians did not gain the right to vote or regain the right to vote until 1947. And of course, the Indigenous people did not have the right to vote until 1960. So, and you may recall in 2015, the election, there was 46 quote-unquote visible minority MPs who were elected to the Canadian Parliament. And some media call it watershed moment in our history. Others describe it as record-breaking, a victory for Canada's multiculturalism, as if we, the people of color, have finally arrived. Yet in reality, out of the total of 338 seats, the politicians from the various racialized groups made up just over 13% of the parliament, when the population of the so-called visible minority in Canada today is around 19%. And the largest three groups are South Asian, Chinese, and Blacks, who made up of 61% of all the communities of color. And Trudeau then appointed his cabinet, saying that he has chosen a group that looks like Canada. Of course, he neglected to mention that apart from, I think, 4 South Asian cabinet ministers and maybe a West Asian cabinet ministers, there are no other racialized groups represented in the cabinet. So when we're talking about the electoral reform today, for myself, and when I consider which system of election would be best for our democracy, I have 2 questions in mind, and this is my own personal view. First of all, which electoral system will be able to best engage the marginalized groups, including racialized communities, new Canadians, in order to ensure their full participation in the democratic process? And my second question is, regardless of the process that we chose, what do we need to do to make our political bodies more reflective of the racial diversity of Canada? And so I use these 2 questions to guide me in my reading of the report, and I actually did read up to 155 pages when I was traveling between Ottawa and Toronto yesterday. And I have to say that I'm a little bit disappointed. The special committees did make some passing references to some experts, and they didn't name the experts. Like some experts were saying that we have to pay special attention when we choose the reform. We have to make sure that certain groups like women, racialized groups, people with disabilities are not being disenfranchised. They made that passing remark, but there is no specific recommendation or even an attempt of coming up with any recommendation to address the issue, particularly for racialized communities. And this is in contrast with the committee's report and treatment of some of the other underrepresented groups or groups that are currently not as engaged in the political process as they should, including the Indigenous peoples, students, youth, people with disabilities, women. There was some kind of a specific suggestions or, quotes from experts on how to increase their democratic participation, and particularly in the case of Indigenous people and women, which of course deal with their political representation as well. So I guess my point is, I look forward to this discussion. And the fact that these issues are not even being addressed fully is one of the key reasons why we need to talk about electoral reform today. Thank you.